Hello and welcome to Curator for Camera with me, Andrew McLean, Head Curator of the National Rail Museum in York. And today we're going to be looking at the Cape Government Locomotive Class 7, number 390. So the locomotive behind me may not be the most famous in the National Collection, but the story it's got to tell is truly remarkable. In a 78-year career, this locomotive has seen so much. Constructed in Glasgow, then shipped across to Southern Africa, where it worked for Cape Government Railways. It's mirrored the history of Africa from colonial to post-colonial times. But that's not the end of the story as well, because the locomotive returns in a great adventure to the UK in the 1970s through the auspices of one of the greatest British artists of the last 100 years. Now, this locomotive was designed by the Cape Government Railways own superintendent, a chap called Hazlitt Beattie. That locomotive type, the Class 7, was designed in 1890. This is a slightly later version, the 7A, from 1896. Very, very important time in Southern African history because of the exploitation of the diamonds and later gold from the Transvaal as well. And that brings into the picture as well Cecil Rhodes, whose idea of building a railway from Cape to Cairo, so basically a railway from the very top of Africa to the very bottom of Africa, was designed very much with the idea of cementing British rule, but also cutting off lines of supply to imperial competitors like Belgium, France and Germany. The Cape to Cairo Railway was never completed, but it's one of the great unfinished railway projects of the 19th century. It tells you a lot about men like Rhodes and about what their ambitions were. A very, very controversial figure because a lot of that wealth was being taken out of Africa at the time and local populations were being badly put upon. But later in life, post-colonial story is very, very interesting for this engine. It then gets acquired by the Zambezi Sawmill Railway and gets taken up to Zambia to work on this incredible railway, which was taking wood from forests around the Zambezi area of Zambia. Before we hear more about some of those remarkable stories, let's just go and have a little look at the engine and point out some of the features of this rather remarkable engine. So start off with the smoke box here. Slightly different, of course, to your standard UK locomotive smoke box. So it gives a certain sense this isn't a British engine, even though it was built in the UK. You see there the centre boss where the smoke box door there. It's rather nice. Then we go up. We've got the replica of the original lamp that would have been on this locomotive when it first went to Southern Africa in the 1890s. There's a few bit of replications here, because right down at the bottom we've also got a replica cow catcher. Although given that this was operating in various countries on the African continent, it wasn't just cows that we had to watch out for here. And we're going to come back to the front in a little moment because something very, very important about the width of this locomotive. I just want to point out something on the side of the smoke box here. This is just a little works plate that says something about the boiler itself and various tests that were undertaken in the 1920s. Now if you just see just at the top left-hand corner there, you'll see that the writing, we have boiler, but also under it we have the word kettle, and that's in Afrikaans, because of course this was in Southern Africa. So it's in English and Afrikaans, and it's quite amusing to think that the Afrikaans word for boiler is kettle, because of course that's what a boiler is, effectively, ginormous kettle. The locomotive, although it's high because of that big lamp and the chimney behind it, is much narrower in gauge, the width between the wheels, that you get on a British standard gauge locomotive. Now, gauges of track were very, very important in the 19th century. The various widths were tried out on Britain's railway network with varying degrees of success, but the one that really you see throughout the Britain's network today and throughout most of the world is called standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5 inches. It goes back to the days of the ancient wagon ways in the northeast of England. Basically, it was the width of a horse's backside. But in Africa, the railways were being built to a much narrower gauge called Cape gauge, 3 foot 6 inches. And there were two reasons for that. One was it was much cheaper to build. You're building vast swathes of railway at great expense. So this was about a quarter of the price of standard gauge track. and also because of the nature of the country itself, winding mountainous countryside. So narrow gauge is much easier to navigate because of the tight curves that you encounter on the way. Also in the front here, let's come down to the coupler. And if you can see some of the details here, because I just want to point out a few of the words that you see. So there's a word here that says Atlas. So what's that all about? Then we've got the letters here, SAR. And as we come round, we've got the letters here, or the word Henricote, or Henrico. Now, the first one, Atlas, refers to the Atlas Works in Glasgow, because this is where this locomotive was built by a company called Sharp Stewart. And that's a really important part of the story of this particular locomotive, because Glasgow was the largest manufacturer of locomotives in Europe for a while. People think of Glasgow and think of shipbuilding, but locomotives are very much part of it too. SAR, that stands for South African Railways. Now, this locomotive was built for the Cape Government Railway, which became part of South African Railways in 1910 with the advent of something called the Union of South Africa, which united various African colonies in the south. And finally, Henricote is the name of the coupler. It's a type of Buckeye coupler or Janny coupler, quite common across the world, originally developed in the United States. But this particular version is one that was developed in Belgium, hence the name Henricote of the guy that was behind that. So lots of international aspects go into this locomotive. And let's move around. So we've talked about the Cape gauge. Let's look at the wheel arrangement, because that's very important too. Much smaller wheels than you see on some of the big British locomotives like Flying Scotsman, Mallard and so on. Now this is called a 480 locomotive because it has 4 leading wheels, which you see at the front there. And then you have the 8 driving wheels. And there's no trailing wheel under the cab, so it's called a 480. And that's a wheel arrangement that was begun in the United States as well. And in the States, they call these mastodons. And so as we come down to the wheels, let's have a little look at the details of these leading wheels, because these actually turn out to be much more recent wheels. You can just make out a date here, 1966, I think, maybe 68, but I think this is 66. Now the locomotive was built in 1896, so much more recent. It shows how long this locomotive was in service. Let's come back up again and have a little look a bit higher up on the engine now. These little oil pots. So this is for pouring oil into, but let's open one up and have a look inside, because on this one, it's still got some of its original wicking here, so you'd pour the oil into the wicking there. A locomotive like this would need lots of lubrication. Still a bit of oil in there, which is rather nice. Another nice interesting feature here, the big injector pipe for getting water into the boiler, as you see here. But just look at some of the detailing here. This shows something about the age of the locomotive and the hard life that it's led as well. Lots of bashing's been taking place here over the years, getting ready repairs. In later life, this locomotive wasn't maintained to the very, very highest of standards. So very basic repair jobs had to be done when it was part of the Zambezi Sawmill railway in Zambia. Zambia was a country that became independent in 1964, and the first president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, wanted to celebrate the fact. So he commissioned a famous artist by the name of David Shepherd to come to Zambia to do paintings to celebrate Zambian independence. And David Shepherd wasn't just a great artist, he was a great railway enthusiast and a great railway preservationist. And he was also very, very interested in the conservation of wild animals. This is something that he had a great rapport with Kaunda, and they became lifelong friends. And in return, Kaunda, recognising how Shepherd loved locomotives so much and loved this particular engine, gifted it to him. That's not the end of the story. He had 2 locomotives and a carriage to bring back from Zambia. This was in the early 1970s. Not an easy thing to do when you have to get across the Victoria Falls Bridge. And eventually, after 2 years of adventures and of false dawns, eventually passage was found on a ship called the Tactician, and it sailed out the Manchester Ship Canal in 1975 to unload at the Salford docks, and the locomotive, after 79 years, had returned to this country. And we're going to go down a little bit further, because up at the cab, as we come round, it does look to me as though the cab roof itself is actually roofing felt, so it's a bit like a garden shed. Very sort of ad hoc, perhaps, a much later addition to the locomotive. And then as we come down, we get the cab number 390. That's the original number of the locomotive. Later on, in South African Railways days, it was renumbered 993, and that was the number it had to the end of its working days in the early 1970s. And when it was restored, when it came back to UK, the original number 390 has been added on. So now that we've covered outside of the locomotive, let's go up into the cab and have a look inside there. So here we are in the cab of number 390. Let's have a little look around. Now I'm going to turn to the driving position here, right-hand drive, so let's look through the window there. You can just imagine going through the forest there in the Zambezi Sawmill Railway, of course. Quite a few things missing. You'll see lots of holes and gaps where things have been adjusted or adapted here. So we've got the usual gauges and so on. Here we have injector. Of course the blower here as well. And you'll see in this gauge here we've got the South African Railways SAR on there too. So we come down and you see actually SAR is actually in quite a lot of this stamped across the locomotive, various things here. But what's really quite interesting about this particular locomotive, I think it makes it unique in the national collection when we go down into the fire hole here, firebox. Let's have a little look inside, because originally this was built with a brick arch, which is no longer here, because when this locomotive was first constructed, and for most of its working life, it was powered by coal. But when it went to the Zambezi Sawmill Railway in the early 1970s, wood was plentiful, so it was converted to burn wood instead. There's wonderful footage of David Shepherd loading up this locomotive with wood. The locomotive would just stop, the workers would just jump down from the locomotive, chop down a tree, chop it to bits, and then chuck it up and then onto this tender behind us here. So massive logs of wood would be loaded on here. So it had been 5 tons of coal. I'm not quite sure what the equivalent would be in wood, but there was no shortage of it, so the crews never ever ran out, as it were. That did present its own problems, incidentally, because on a railway like this, where you're going through forests, you've got wood, you've got a locomotive that isn't in the finest condition, lots of sparks and so on are coming out onto the tracks, and it wasn't uncommon for blindside fires to take place. Some quite serious. In fact, David Shepherd recounts stories he was told of the actual trains themselves going on fire, and because of this. And because a lot of trains in that part of Africa would travel at night time to avoid the dangers of the tsetse fly, which didn't come out at night time, you would see the embers burning away like diamonds, as David Shepherd would call them, along the line side, sparkling away into the night. A beautiful scene, but maybe not altogether safe, and one that you'd want to encourage, of course. What stories this cab must be able to tell. Stories of a locomotive that travelled across the seas from Glasgow to southern Africa in the 19th century, and the amazing people who have touched the history of this engine in the course of its lengthy history. There's a nice little postscript to this story as well, because today the locomotive is on display here at the National Rail Museum in York. And this building used to be York North Shed. And it was in that engine shed in the 1950s that a young artist began his career of painting railway scenes. And that was, of course, David Shepherd. And it was one of the great privileges of my job here at the National Rail Museum to have met David just shortly before he died. And he told myself and Anthony Cools that he had one thing he would love to see at the museum. He would love to see his Cape Government Locomotive on display in Great Hall, even though David himself knew that he would not get to see it. And so it was a great pleasure that this is now on display in the very hall in which David began his illustrious painting career. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this Curator for Camera, and if you have, please do like and subscribe as well. And do look out for other editions coming soon.